Good afternoon, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I'm William Chung, Shangri-La Dialogue Senior Fellow for Asia Pacific Security at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. I bring to you apologies from Dr. Tim Huxley, our Executive Director, who is unwell. We just got back from Hanoi last week, and he must have caught something. And I suspect that so I'm the last man standing here. 18 days from the Shangri-La Dialogue, so it's understandable. So Dr. Huxley conveys his apologies, and also thank you to the Minister for gracing this occasion. Now, I'm pleased to welcome you to the 31st IISS Fullerton Lecture, which will be delivered by Minister Balakrishnan, who will speak on the crucial topic of ASEAN 2018 and beyond. This Fullerton Lecture series is intended to encourage thinking and discussion in Singapore and its region about significant regional and international questions of the day. To that end, we have invited a series of important political figures to speak to and engage with our audiences here at the Fullerton. It is wonderful and not at all surprising to see a full house today, drawn from across the Singapore community here this afternoon in the ballroom of Singapore's iconic Fullerton Hotel. Given Singapore's ASEAN chair role for this year, which has incidentally brought the 32nd ASEAN Summit here last month, is a particularly good time to hear from the Minister about the challenges and opportunities for ASEAN, not only during this year, but also beyond that. In many ways, ASEAN has been a successful regional organization. It plays many important roles and has provided a framework for Southeast Asia's growing prosperity, and some would argue security, in the past half a century. It has combined the need to respond to a dynamic regional and international environment, and this has raised expectations of how ASEAN should develop. But sometimes there may be somewhat unrealistic expectations about ASEAN given the diversity of the grouping. No one is better qualified to speak on the topic than Dr. Balakrishnan, and especially from a Singapore perspective. As you know, after a highly successful medical career, Dr. Balakrishnan became a Member of Parliament in 2001, and he has held a wide variety of ministerial portfolios within the government. He became Minister of Foreign Affairs in October 2015. He is concurrently Minister in charge of the Smart Nation initiative. So I think you must be a good social media user too, Minister. So, Minister, again, thank you for coming, and we anticipate your Fullerton lecture with much interest. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be here, and I shall start by noting that we live in very interesting times. And I think you will agree that, I'm not sure, fortunately or unfortunately for Singapore, we've got a lot of work ahead of us. We assume chairmanship against a backdrop of profound and indeed unpredictable changes, sweeping our region, and dare I say, even at a global level. Consequently, one of our key areas of focus as chair of ASEAN has basically been to maintain ASEAN unity and relevance in the midst of these profound changes. Therefore, we chose the themes resilience and innovation. And these are not just meant to be topical buzzwords, but indeed to encapsulate what we believe ASEAN needs to do in order to maintain unity, centrality, and relevance. So let's start first by scanning the broad challenges that confront all of us. The first is that the strategic balance is shifting. And it is shifting both at a global level as well as within the region itself. We see quite obviously rising new powers, China, India, and Southeast Asia. And these are steadily growing the economy. And with growth of the economy, obviously comes the ability to invest in technology. Economy plus technology enhances military weight. And all these lead to strategic heft and a shift in the center of gravity. This has opened up new opportunities for ASEAN. And if you think about ASEAN, or if you think about the Southeast Asian region, we've always been a thoroughfare. A thoroughfare for silk, a thoroughfare for spices, later on for oil and gas. And as world trade exploded in the last 50 years, it has been a vital channel for goods. So this has meant, therefore, that Southeast Asia has always been exposed to the tidal pulls of increasing economic and therefore strategic competition amongst the major powers. Because we connect China to Europe, certainly that was the case in the case of silks. We connected Southeast Asia to Europe for spices. We connected the Middle East to China and Japan for fossil fuels. And of course, now we all know the $5 trillion worth of trade flows through the South China Sea. The key challenge then, knowing that we are in a sense a traffic junction, is whether we can maintain our position, our relevance, and our unity, or whether everyone just rides roughshod over us. We therefore want to maintain an open and inclusive and what we call an ASEAN-led regional architecture. We want to be friends with all, and we want to be able to collaborate with all the powers, big and small, in order to benefit our region and to expand opportunities for our people. That's the first challenge, dealing with a shift. The second challenge is that we are in the midst of a new revolution, and I refer to the digital revolution. In fact, we are still in the early phase of this digital revolution, going beyond just computing and connectivity. The new platform technologies of robotics, artificial intelligence, and big data are transforming jobs, radically transforming economies, societies, and even the politics. History has taught us that technological mastery begets geopolitical influence. The reason we're using English today in this room is because the Industrial Revolution began in England and in Europe. And that gave Europe a head start, and in a sense also led to our colonization by European powers. Today's digital revolution, I believe, is no less a transformation of that paradigm. I want to deviate a little bit and ask you to consider the Industrial Revolution, characterized by the manufacture of physical goods, urbanization, the development of cities, and especially cities along riverways or international straits or along the sea, ports. And competitive advantage was derived by economies of scale, gaining access to global markets, and getting access to the lowest cost raw materials as possible. And countries, especially for developing countries that wanted to get up onto that ladder, competed by offering low-cost, hardworking, disciplined labor. That's the paradigm of the Industrial Revolution. The question is, what is the paradigm And what are the sources of competitive advantage in the digital revolution? I think in the digital revolution, we are seeing a transformation from the age of mass production to the age of mass customization. Second, you are seeing that more and more products, goods and services can now be intermediated directly or indirectly through digital means. And the key change that digital medium introduces is the fact that the cost of replicating something and the cost of transmitting something. If you think about your email, cut and copy is free, sending something is virtually free. When you start doing this, replication and transmission at very low cost rates, and you transfer this to goods and services, you get a different paradigm. Then it is about smart cities that are connected. And I spend more time examining fiber optic maps of the world than I do just looking at geography and international straits. The law of the sea is still very important, but cyberspace is an equally vital global commons. Another example is that where in the past developing countries competed to offer low-cost labor, today we have to compete to offer low hurdles caused by policy red tape. We need enlightened regulations. And also in a digital world, a small startup can theoretically have a market that's global. But at the same time, competition is also intensified. So my point is that because there's such a paradigm change and a revolution occurring, we live actually in an age of mass anxiety, and especially middle-class anxiety. The white-collar middle class that was brought up under the aegis of the Industrial Revolution thought that jobs were secure and education, literacy, was sufficient. But today, the middle class is anxious. And in particular, the middle class in developed countries, the countries that first reaped the harvests of the Industrial Revolution, have been watching wage stagnation, have been watching Rust Belts developing, and have been reflecting great anxiety. And my point is that if governments and if the leadership cannot explain to people what is going on and cannot convince your population that we've got what it takes to invest in the infrastructure and in the skills capacity of our people, if you can't give your people confidence to cope with this new revolution, then the siren calls of populism and xenophobia become very compelling. And in a sense, if you look at various outcomes of elections and referenda over the last couple of years, in fact, this is a symptom of this underlying political anxiety. So that's my second major challenge. The third challenge is on the security front. And the point is that the security challenges today are increasingly faceless, nameless, and borderless. We need to be resilient to both the conventional security equations, but we also need to deal with unconventional threats, terrorism, cyber attacks, which have become increasingly prevalent in our region. And these challenges do not reflect the neat Westphalian borders that define the nation state. We know that ISIS is supposed to have been defeated militarily in Iraq and Syria. Yet it continues to propagate its dangerous ideology and foment trouble, particularly in Southeast Asia, which is a receptive and sometimes fertile ground for these ideologies. If you needed to be convinced, well, the attacks yesterday in Surabaya, apparently conducted by one single family that is supposed to have returned from Syria, conducted including children, is a stark reminder of the power of ideology. We are also witnessing more cyber attacks as we push for greater digitalization. In a sense, the more we depend on it, the more vulnerable we become. And in today's internet age, the guise of anonymity and the proliferation of fragmented echo chambers. You know, I mentioned just now that we're reaching the end of the age of mass production and we're shifting to the age of mass customization. Well, in the media space, I think we're reaching the end of the age of broadcasting and we're watching the rise of narrowcasting. And all of us increasingly being trapped in our respective echo chambers. Is it therefore a wonder that our politics is fractured, our society is divided, and we are unable to find consensus and to locate the middle ground? All this means that these threats, military and cyber and ideological, are in fact much harder to deal with. Fourth challenge is that for 70 years, we have depended on an open, rules-based, multilateral trading system. Indeed, it goes beyond the trading system. It has almost been a political philosophy. Some people used to call it the Washington consensus, except nowadays I'm not sure there's any consensus in Washington. But we have taken it for granted that free trade, cross-border investments, economic integration, multilateralism, and a rules-based world order were good things, were essential to achieve peace and prosperity. But yet today, if you really seriously ask your population, you know that the political mood has changed and has shifted against this concept of a consensus. And indeed, free trade has become a convenient scapegoat for working and middle class disaffection. Remember, I explained just now the change due to the technological revolution. But you see, it's much harder to deliver a rousing rally speech on digital disruption. Much easier to blame free trade, globalization, and foreigners. We've witnessed with concern emerging trade friction between the United States and China. And in fact, this has been brewing for some time. We note the announcement of unilateral tariffs. And when one side announces it, the other side immediately announces a suite of counter tariffs. And the specter of free trade has never been more real. And for Singapore, because our trade is about 3 times our GDP, we have to be deeply concerned. And there's no easy answer to dealing with this political angst. The US share of global GDP was 40% in 1960. Its relative share has shrunk to 25% today. When this happens, it is an entirely understandable and legitimate political question for the voters in the United States to ask whether the United States should continue to unilaterally underwrite the global world order that has sustained us for the past 70 years. After all, every politician has to justify its program to its local electorate. So the point I'm making, without any value judgments, is that this angst and this anxiety and this question about free trade and whether the Washington consensus should prevail and whether the United States should unilaterally underwrite it. These are all perfectly legitimate political questions. Having said that, if we do end up with a full-blown trade war between the world's two largest economies, there will be serious ramifications on all of us. I mentioned the volume of trade, the ratio of trade to GDP for Singapore being 3. Even for ASEAN, trade in goods accounts for 90% of ASEAN's GDP. And the US and China accounted for 26% of ASEAN's total merchandise trade of US $2.2 trillion in 2016. The US and China are the most important, the US and China have the most important bilateral relationship, most important to the rest of us as well. And competition between these two powers is to be expected, but whether this competition takes place within a framework of interdependence and generally accepted international rules, or will it degenerate into unilateral and retaliatory measures? That makes all the difference. Ultimately, to quote my Prime Minister, what is at stake is war and peace, security and stability for the world. Having outlined these 4 major themes of challenges confronting us, let me try, in the short time available, spell out how we believe ASEAN should respond. At our recent summit, our leaders adopted a vision statement for a resilient and innovative ASEAN. You can look it up. It captures our leaders' assessment of our changing landscape. It articulates their overarching vision for ASEAN's future 3 years since the ASEAN community was established in 2015. It sets out our key principles that underpin this collective vision and injects political impetus into the slate of concrete initiatives which are listed in that document. So the point is, we need to translate this reality, this vision, into reality. And in the immediate term, ASEAN member states are working to address several challenges that affect our regional peace and stability. And let me cite a few examples. First, the threat posed by ISIS. You've seen it in the southern Philippines, you see it in Indonesia, and of course, we also worry about Rakhine State in Myanmar. At its peak, the ISIS campaign to establish a caliphate in Marawi city was arguably the most visceral and visible and present danger that terrorism posed to our region. I think even my Filipino counterparts were surprised at how long it took to clear that threat. The Philippines did clear the threat, dealt with it effectively, and ASEAN in our own small way did what we could to assist them in terms of providing resources and support. On our part, Singapore was able to contribute drones and urban warfare training to help our Filipino brothers. And ASEAN member states have also been working together to tackle radicalization at its roots, which ultimately is a political battle for hearts and minds, and especially for young people. And this is not something that you can deal with simply through intelligence and military operations. Second, we mobilized the ASEAN Coordinating Center for Humanitarian Assistance on Disaster Management to deliver assistance to all the affected communities in the Rakhine State. We recognize that Rakhine State, if not properly resolved, will be another hotbed for radicalization, violent extremism, and we need to work together to avert this. We are ready to support efforts by all parties to work together to achieve a long-term viable solution so that people can rebuild their lives, rebuild homes, and ultimately have hope and peace. You need a political solution. Third, we have tried our best to reduce tensions in the South China Sea, and in particular, the negotiations on a code of conduct. The code of conduct does not set out to resolve long-standing sovereignty disputes, and that's worth remembering. In fact, my own sense is that long-standing could extend to generations. But what we are trying to do is to reaffirm a rules-based approach to managing the situation at sea and de-escalating tension. This exercise of negotiating a COC is also a valuable platform which, if properly handled and if all parties approach it with good faith, is also an opportunity to enhance and strengthen strategic trust between the 10 member states of ASEAN and China. But the truth is, there remains deep-seated differences. And I don't want to trivialize or to assume that it's a matter of a clever turn of phrase. It's not so simple. But we do have to make step-by-step progress, and we have to continue to negotiate in good faith. We also need to enhance our mutual trust and confidence, and we hope and we implore all parties to exercise self-restraint in the conduct of activities that may otherwise complicate or aggravate the situation. Singapore will co-chair the COC process until our term as ASEAN-China coordinator ends, should I say, fortunately, in August 2018, which is 3 months' time. But nevertheless, rest assured, we will continue to support these efforts to formulate an effective code of conduct. Now, whilst tackling these urgent and immediate issues, ASEAN also has to keep up the momentum towards long-term issues. So at our recent summit, the leaders launched 2 flagship initiatives. The first is the ASEAN Smart Cities Network. Again, I've explained to you our thoughts on the circumstances behind this digital revolution. And establishing an ASEAN Smart Cities Network is a response to that. We hope to establish an ecosystem of 26 pioneer smart cities throughout Southeast Asia who can come together, articulate a common framework for smart city development, craft specific action plans, match needs and capability, draw in investments, share mistakes, avoid those mistakes, and in particular, to make our economies, and especially our digital economies, interoperate. If we do this, it will be the digital reflection of ASEAN's prior investments in infrastructure and connectivity. And if we do it right, we will expand opportunities and especially job opportunities for our people and our small enterprises scattered throughout Southeast Asia. So let's wait and see what projects, initiatives emerge from this Smart Cities Network. Now, the flip side of this is that even as we seek to digitalize more aspects of our society and economy, we will also become more vulnerable to cybersecurity. And that's why our leaders also published a statement on cybersecurity cooperation. It'll send a clear political signal of the importance that we place on cybersecurity, captures our vision for a peaceful, secure, and resilient cyberspace that will act as a platform that will facilitate economic growth, deepen connectivity, and raise living standards for all. Against the backdrop of growing protectionism, ASEAN needs to double down on the cause for free trade. And that's why what's the other thing that's going to keep us busy over the next few months is to try to settle the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership by the end of this year, the RCEP. The RCEP, if we succeed, will include 45% of the world's population and 1/3 of the global GDP into a single integrated market. Together with the recently concluded CPTPP, which was the original TPP minus a significant player. But if you put the RCEP and the CPTPP together, these become fundamental pillars for what we hope ultimately will be a free trade area of the Asia Pacific. But at the strategic level, it is an example of ASEAN holding on and in fact doubling down on the importance of free trade as a formula for peace and prosperity for our future. So we've had a busy start to the year. We've adopted several initiatives. Our objective is to make our region future ready. And in a sense, I'm trying to give you an idea that we want to focus attention on tomorrow's jobs and not squabble about yesterday's battles and even yesterday's trade and technological challenges. It's important for us to keep our eyes forward. And we believe if we can all do this, our prospects remain bright. 60% of the 630 million population of ASEAN is below the age of 35. And this represents a demographic dividend that has not yet been harvested. This, in fact, stands in stark contrast to the situation in Northeast Asia, even in Europe, I could say. And we must give our young people jobs. We must give them skills for the future and hope for the future. Our combined ASEAN GDP stood at $2.55 trillion US dollars in 2016, and we have a compound annual growth rate of over 5% in the last decade. If we can keep this growth rate up, and because the demographic winds are in our sails, and if we can continue to invest in digital infrastructure and in skills capacity, we believe ASEAN is set to become the world's 4th largest single market by 2030. And in fact, there are some estimates that ASEAN's digital economy alone could grow to US 200 billion by 2025. But these challenges lay ahead of us, and I'm always reminded that we don't have control over tectonic forces. We live in a very different world from the 60s when ASEAN was formed. The first, basically the non-communist part of Southeast Asia. And we decided we would have, if we didn't hang together, we would hang individually. And in the 60s, the United States drew a line and committed blood and treasure to hold the line in Vietnam and Korea, and gave the rest of us time and space to develop and prove that this model worked. Today, we live in very different circumstances, and the chief underwriter is having second thoughts. But we also live in a time of enormous opportunity because of this digital revolution. And if we get our priorities right, execute our programs, then, in fact, I really believe that ASEAN's golden age lies ahead of us. So thank you for your attention. I'll take questions now, and the more robust and frank, the better. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Minister, for a very comprehensive assessment of the kind of the environment that ASEAN lives in. Your points, quintessential Singapore fashion, scoping out the challenges and the opportunities. And I like your point about ASEAN being exposed to the tidal pool of geopolitical change. Your points about digital disruption, and the need for open rules-based order, trading system. That is what you were saying. And the kind of promise that we can see in the RCEP and the CPTPP,
Yes.
as we know today. So we have about 20 minutes of question and answer where we'll open the floor to questions. But I'd like to exercise my chairman's prerogative and ask you a rather pointed question, if you don't mind.
Sure. You'll inspire them to give more pointed questions.
Yes. You mentioned open rules-based multilateral trading system, or what you say to be the Washington consensus, or what is now seen to be the Washington consensus. You know that in the last 6 months or so, there are 4 major powers, extra ASEAN regional powers,
Yes.
Australia, Japan, India, the United States. They have been having high-level meetings, and they've been talking about an Indo-Pacific strategy to this part of the world. And kind of the way Singapore puts it, highlighting principles and aspirations that countries in this region should adhere to, principles of the rule of law, restraint from the use of force, supporting international law, and maritime security, freedom of navigation. So my colleagues and I, we talked to enough diplomats and officials from countries, and we were having a betting pool on about, if the Quad becomes 5 or 6 or 7, which other countries might, have an inclination to join the Quad. So I'd like to hear from you, Minister. Is Singapore kind of one of the countries that might be courted to go into the Quad?
No.
Or
No, the short answer is no. Let me give you the long answer. We are facing a whole alphabet soup. Belt and Road,
Yep.
FOIP, and throw in all the acronyms for the free trade arrangements, right? Again, let's get back to fundamental principles. What is it that we in Southeast Asia want? We know that whether you're talking about the Belt and Road or the free and open Indo-Pacific, all roads still pass through us. So the first question when someone comes to me with a bunch of alphabets is to say, what in your concept of regional architecture, what place does Southeast Asia have? Are we central? Are we relevant? Do we have speaking rights? In fact, do we have decision-making capacity? So, excuse me, I'm always going, by definition, to emphasize ASEAN as the main alphabet soup. So that's the first thing.
Okay.
The primacy of ASEAN centrality and hopefully unity in order to maintain relevance. Because otherwise, we become divided, or people just ride over us, and we have no say. First thing. The second point, and this reflects our perspective as a small state, that we believe in multilateralism, in rule of law, in having access to peaceful resolution of dispute, because by definition, we're small. And if big powers are going to insist on settling things purely on bilateral basis, bilateral negotiations, on what basis will you decide the outcomes? Might is right. So by definition, I'm saying we want a rules-based multilateral system. The third point, at the risk of being undiplomatic, is to misappropriate, I think it was Bill Clinton's election slogan. It's the economy, stupid. So whatever plans you come up with, what does this mean for economic growth and jobs and opportunities for Southeast Asian citizens? And in particular, I've already outlined, we need investments in connectivity, both physical and digital. We need access to markets, we need access to technology, and we need to ensure that in this new digital world, at least some Southeast Asian companies and enterprises make it into the big league. So what I'm giving you is our considerations. When someone comes to me and presents a plan, I say, okay, well, show me. Where does this leave ASEAN? What does this mean for a rules-based multilateral world? And what does this mean for the economy? And then we'll take it as that. I would say, quite frankly, right now, the so-called free and open Indo-Pacific has not yet fleshed out sufficient level of resolution to answer these questions that I've posed. And in typical Singapore fashion, we never sign on to anything unless we know exactly what it means.
Yeah. Thank you very much. That's very well said. I think to paraphrase Clinton's quote, I will quote Tom Cruise from Barry Maguire, where he says, "Show me the money." So if the Quad members approach ASEAN in Singapore, well, show me the money. Show us the investments, connectivity. Well said. Now we have 15 minutes for questions, and please state your name, affiliation, and I would strongly encourage you to end your sentence with a question mark. You know, less comments, more questions, please. I see the lady seated right there. Yeah, please.
Is there a mic for her?
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Lynn Kwok, IISS. You mentioned earlier that, from what you said earlier, I suspect that Singapore hasn't quite been convinced about the utility of the Indo-Pacific concept and why Singapore or ASEAN should be signing up. But what happens in a situation where, in fact, that train moves along because of the focus that the United States has placed on it and the other powers as well as the other Quad members as well have placed on it? How does ASEAN see it fitting? How does ASEAN see itself as fitting into this Indo-Pacific concept and its nod to the Quad? Can it make itself relevant, and if so, how?
Well, I'm going to look at it from an ASEAN-centric perspective. And I think the first point I would make is that it is possible for all these concepts, properly envisioned and properly executed, whether it's Belt and Road and free IP, to coexist and in fact present a win-win combination for Southeast Asia. So I'm not being negative. I'm making the argument for being inclusive rather than exclusive, for being open and rules-based. And I think another way of expressing it in political terms is that Southeast Asian countries do not want to be forced into making false choices or forced choices. We want to be open and inclusive, and we believe therein lies the road for peace and prosperity. And we'll wait and see.
It could be said that, like you said, the Indo-Pacific strategy, there's not enough flesh on the bone at the moment, apart from a few communiques by foreign affairs ministries of 4 countries. So even if we were asked to sign, there's nothing to sign off on, I mean, in terms of the real details.
Yeah.
So,
but just remember that between the Indian and the Pacific Ocean is Southeast Asia.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there are only 2 straits that connect. It's the Straits of Malacca and the Sunda Straits, unless you want to go around through Australia, of course.
Yeah, all right. Thank you. Alan Chong, please.
It's Ian, not Alan. It's my colleague from RSIS.
Oh, sorry.
Oh.
Yeah.
So, Minister, I just had a couple of quick questions. One is, if there's a tangible mark that Singapore wants its chairmanship to leave on ASEAN, the organization, what would that be? And how would we be able to ascertain how closely or how far we fall from that mark over time, of course? And secondly, we talked about the COC. I'm curious as to what your take is on the relationship between the militarization of maritime features in the South China Sea and the COC process. Thank you.
Thank you. You're asking for our legacy before we're even halfway through our chairmanship. But let me just cite two examples. I think if during our term we have commenced this process of digitalization across ASEAN, and in particular my point on interoperability. So for instance, our e-payment systems, our trade systems, trade finance, customs facilitation, single windows. If we can get single interoperable windows throughout ASEAN, I think this would be a significant achievement. Second is a more intangible point. But you know, in Singapore, we've done our best, and sometimes we've even paid a political price for neutrality and that sense of balance, and to be able to be friends with all, but sometimes from time to time politely disagree. If we can increase the level of confidence in adopting such a foreign policy posture and do our best then to build ASEAN unity, I think that would be a worthwhile contribution. But you remember that Singapore can never be the leader of ASEAN. We are too small. But we hope in our own small way to give confidence that this is a reasonable posture that can be taken by all Southeast Asian nations. But let's see, as I said, we are not in command of the tectonic forces that impinge upon us.
Thank you. Alex New. Alex, you have a question? Alex is my partner in crime at the IISS.
Always a formula for trouble.
Thank you very much, William. Minister, you mentioned the importance of this new digital revolution and the future of employment and opportunity for ASEAN. You've also mentioned the importance of a rules-based international system. But increasingly, we know that China is starting to dominate the digital infrastructure and telecommunications environment in this part of the world and beyond. And you'll also recognize that China has a very different view of freedom of navigation, if you like, within cyberspace, and that is based on cyber sovereignty. Do you see a clash of interests between ASEAN's future in the digital domain and that of China?
I'm very glad you asked that question, because I've been thinking about this for quite some time. My own belief is that just as we have developed a law of the sea and a UN convention of the law of the sea, and it has been a very, first it symbolizes, it iconifies that there is a global commons, and the sea has been a global commons, particularly for free trade. And that you needed to have some rules which everyone could sign up to and hopefully abide with. Although I must say some major powers have not yet ratified the Convention on the Law of the Sea. Now, I believe cyberspace and space up there is another arena of the global commons. And we do need to generate the equivalent of UNCLOS for cyberspace and for planetary or space above us. You see, if you think a little bit deeper into the polemics behind cyberspace, you get some examples where they say, well, this is nothing more than just, if you're speaking from a state perspective, say this is just another question of jurisdiction, right, over territory. That's one perspective, state supremacy. There has been another myth a founding mythology of the internet, which is no rules needed, leave it to us, trust us. Usually it's the big platform companies that say, trust us. Well, I think recent events have shown that's not viable either. So even whilst people, or some people may have reservations with ceding all say on this to state governments, I think the other point of leaving it with no rules and letting the private sector develop is also equally fallacious. So I think we need to find a middle ground, and my own suggestion is for the UN in a multilateral setting to develop some set of common rules which we can all subscribe to that would expand economic opportunities, protect the rights of individuals, and it also provide security. And if we can do this, I think the world will be in a better position. But to engage in futile debates between it's entirely state-driven or it's entirely private sector-driven, I don't think that's very useful. So it's a point that we need to work on. I'm sorry, I think I missed your question on COC and the militarization. Our view is that militarization complicates matters. But you know as well as I do that when the different states often state that their claims are indisputable, and what is in dispute, and therefore what they need to do in order to protect their rights, it gets very complicated. But if you just ask me on the matter of principle, is it helpful? I think it complicates matters. What can we do in the short term? The short term, the challenge is still to generate a COC that is meaningful. And remember that we signed the DOC, a declaration, 16 years ago?
2002.
Right?
16 years ago.
16 years ago. I won't say it's been unhelpful, but there are limits to it. So surely the COC has got to be more effective than the DOC. And in the meantime, I'm asking and appealing for good faith and sincerity in this process.
Thank you. We just have time for one last question, so I'll give it to the lady in black here in the middle. Thanks.
Thank you so much. My name is Pranoti Surve. I'm with Bank of America Merrill Lynch's corporate security team here in Asia. You made a reference earlier on that it's no longer just about having robust intelligence or traditional law enforcement.
Yes.
And I think that is 100% the case. We're also seeing this within the private sector, where I think we're dealing with the insider threat, we're thinking about, rational profiling within the constructs of ensuring that every single individual is guaranteed their human rights, so on and so forth.
Yes.
And, we obviously see that, playing out in the public sector sphere as well.
Yes.
As far as Singapore is concerned, I think, traditionally through history, Singapore has had a very, security has always been a state subject. Something that's been held by the government of Singapore, very close to the chest, and,
Yes.
every single security policy is typically played out, within the hallways of the MFA, MINDEF, MHA, so on and so forth.
Yes.
But I think as security is evolving, the concept of security is evolving, and as you said, we're looking at faceless, nameless actors, often
Yes.
transnational, often trans-jurisdictional. Law enforcement is therefore required to become more and more trans-jurisdictional. And so this is a little bit of a softball question, I think, but I'm going to ask it anyway. How is Singapore preparing for security in the future? Not security as it stands today, not security for threats of the past, but security constructs and structures for the future. Thank you.
Well, that's why a lot of our ASEAN cooperation, sometimes it doesn't get enough publicity by definition, is in the intelligence and operational fields. And it's something our agencies, both our military as well as our security agencies, work very hard on. And fortunately that works. I'm afraid it's one of those things where I have to say, trust me. But it works. Now, having said that, if you do a Google search on ISIS Bahasa, just search those two, you will get a whole huge treasure trove of material, wonderful Arabic music, beautiful panoramas of deserts and landscapes. The spoken language is Bahasa, which is understood in Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and Brunei, and it's subtitled in English. You stop to think about it, it's very clear that that combination, right, Arabic music, spoken Bahasa, and subtitled English, is directed at us and our people. Even in Singapore alone, we have, I think the last 3 years, in terms of teens, number of people whom we've had to bring in, self-radicalized. They've never been to Syria or to the Middle East. Just in the privacy of their bedroom, their laptops, or probably nowadays the mobile phone. And it doesn't even take very long to radicalize someone. So your traditional methods of identifying and profiling and taking action, it's very difficult when you're going after, what security agencies call lone wolves or clean skins, right? By definition, you have to search harder for digital footprints preemptively. And yet, how do you do that without getting the whole kerfuffle that Ed Snowden created? Right. So again, I'm making the point that we do need to generate some rules, some common agreed rules of engagement at a global level, because we're dealing with a global threat. And then we need to win the battles, the real battle, which is for hearts and minds. And from my own perspective, we may live in a very digital, very apparently advanced world, but we haven't yet started altering the human genome. So human beings actually haven't changed. It's just technology that has changed. And my understanding of human beings is that we all have a need to belong. We all have a need to feel some meaning and significance in our lives. And technology does not provide that sense of belonging and that sense of empowerment that comes from significance. And that is why these siren calls from extremism are so compelling in this age when, it cannot just be about money. It cannot just be about power. You have to give people that sense of belonging, participation, and meaning. And so it comes back to those fundamentals that even when I talked about the end of broadcasting, the end of common experiences, we do need to connect people and we do need to share something. And hopefully we share enough so that they are common dreams and not diverse nightmares. And this is something which actually governments are not really well set up to do. In the past, it was the village, religion, language, culture that fulfilled that hunger, especially for young people, right? And so the most dangerous is a young man alienated from society, disconnected from culture and religion, or has very weak religious grounding, and becomes ripe for radicalization. So this is something which, in a case of Singapore, we're very fortunate that we've got very enlightened religious leaders. So we don't start off by denying the role of religion. We start by affirming the fact that in Singapore, I think 90% of people profess some religion. And that our religions as practice must be inclusive and not exclusionary. And that we must safeguard that common space and common lived experience, so that people will realize that actually let's work on constructing the future, a future with hope and a future with fairness and justice. And we believe that is the way forward, but you know, it's easy to sit here and pontificate, much harder to execute in real life. But that, to me, I think is the fundamental political challenge of our time, to give young people a sense of belonging and a sense of significance and meaning in our lives.
Thank you very much, Minister. I think this is the 31st Fullerton lecture. I think this is the first time to use a Singapore manufactured acronym that a foreign minister has mentioned, BPM, belonging, participation, and meaning in a Fullerton lecture. So I want to congratulate you on putting all the issues very well together. I have to bring this Fullerton lecture to a close, but again, please join me in thanking the Minister for gracing this present.
Thank you.
And we wish you all the best for your ASEAN chair for the rest of the year.
Thank you. Thank you all.